Alrighty, good afternoon, students. This is the second lecture in the Flipped Classroom lecture series, reviewing literary lenses, literary criticism, and today we are going to go a little bit into what a close reading means. So, for my last lecture, I talked to all of you about what the different literary criticism lenses were. So if you can just think of a couple of them right now, give you about 5 seconds or so. Just think of the ones that we discussed yesterday, and especially the one that you wrote in your blog post for homework. So we have biographical criticism, feminist, Marxist, historical, things like that. So today what I'm going to do is actually model a sample reading for you, and I'm going to analyze a passage using a literary lens. And I'm going to say my thought process aloud so you guys can see how I apply a critical literary lens to a piece of literature. So today we're going to discuss the short story, The Gift of the Magi. So I'm going to read it out loud for all of you, and then we're going to go over it together through a literary lens. So it begins here. $1.87. That was all, and 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied. 3 times Della counted it, $1.87, and the next day would be Christmas. There was clearly nothing to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl. So Della did it, which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sniffles predominating. While the mistress of the home is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second, take a look at the home. A furnished flat at $8 per week. It did not exactly beggar description, but it had certainly the word on the lookout for the Medici squad. In the vestibule below was a letter box into which no letter would go, and an electric button from which no moral finger could coax a ring. Also appertaining thereunto was a card bearing the name Mr. James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a formal period of prosperity when its processor was being paid $30 per week. Now, when the income was shrunk to just $20, though, they were thinking of seriously contracting to a modest and unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim, and greatly hugged by Miss James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which is all very good. Della finished her first cry and attended to her cheeks with the powder rag. She stood by the window and looked out dully at a gray cat walking a gray fence in a gray yard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she only had $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She had been saving every penny she could for months, with this result. $20 a week doesn't go far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. They always are. Only $1.87 to buy a present for Jim. Her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him, something fine and rare and sterling, something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor of being owned by Jim. There was a pier glass between the windows of the room. Perhaps you've seen a pier glass in an $8 flat. A very thin and very agile person may, by observing his reflection in a rapid sequence of longitudinal strips, obtain a fairly accurate conception of looks. Della, being slender, had mastered the art. Suddenly she whirled from the window and stood before the glass. Her eyes were shining brilliantly, but her face had lost its color within 20 seconds. Rapidly she pulled down her hair and let it fall to its full length. Now there were 2 possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs, in which they both took mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the air shaft, Della would have let her hang out the window day to just dry deprecate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor, with all of his treasures piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to see him pluck his beard from envy. So now Della's beautiful hair fell about her, rippling and shining a cascade of brown waters. It reached below her knee, and made itself almost a garment for her. And then she did it up again nervously. Once she faltered for a minute, and stood while a tear or two splashed on the worn red carpet. On went her old brown jacket, on went her old brown hat. With a whirl of skirts, and with the brilliant sparkle still in her eyes, she fluttered to the door and down the stairs to the street, where she stopped, and the sign read, Hair goods of all kinds. One flight up Della ran and collected herself, panting. Madame, large, too white, chilly, hardly looked. "Will you buy my hair?" asked Della. "I buy hair," said Madame. "Take your hat off and let's have a slight at the looks of it." Down rippled the brown cascade. $20, said Madame, lifting the mass with a practised hand. "Give it to me quick," said Della. Oh, and the next 2 hours tripped on by rosy wings. Forget the hash metaphor. She was ransacking the stores for Jim's present. Surely she found it at last. It had been made for Jim and no one else. There was none other like it in any of the stores, and she had turned them all inside out. It was a platinum fob chain, simple and chaste in design, properly proclaiming its value by substance alone, and not by ornamentation, as all good things should do. It was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew it must be Jim's. It was like him. Quietness and value, the description applied to both. $20 it took from her, and she hurried home with 87 cents. With the chain on his watch and be properly anxious about the time in any company. Grand as the watch was, he sometimes looked at it on the sly, on account of the old leather strap they used in place of a chain. The rest of the story does go a little bit longer, but for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of wrap up what we read so far and help you guys understand what exactly a critical lens means. So for this story, I'm personally going to select the feminist criticism lens. I'm going to use the highlighter application tool that I have online and highlight some important parts in the story. So, what are some things that stand out to you as a feminist lens criticism? Of course, this first line, which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sobs predominating. I mean, come on, that is definitely a catch to women who are always crying and always sad. The deeper you read into this, the more feminist criticism you see going on here. Let's see. We have Della finished her cry and attended to her cheeks with the powder rag. So Della is at home cleaning, cooking, doing makeup, crying, while her husband is out making the money and actually doing the work. Another thing that was very, very striking to me as I was reading was that it said many a happy hour she spent planning for something nice for him. So she spent a lot of time fantasizing gifts for him, but then she says right here, nothing is near to being worthy of the honor of being owned by Jim. Owned by Jim. That's going to highlight in pink. The fact that she says that she's owned by another man definitely speaks to the feminist criticism lens. Let's look back at that PowerPoint that I showed you guys yesterday. As you can see right here, it says, how are men and women, masculine and feminine, portrayed differently in the text? Well, all we've seen with Della so far is crying, doing her makeup. She feels owned by her husband. She feels pressure to buy him something nice, even though they don't have a lot of money. Definitely making her feminine role seem like the kind of stay-at-home housewife that gets her husband nice things while her husband is actually out making the money and becoming the breadwinner. So definitely a feminist angle. Then we have this whole part right here about the mirror and how Della is very slender and how a person who has pure glass has a mirror. That's just, again, making fun of women and how they are always looking in the mirror, very vain, always worried about their reflection, things like that. These are definitely things that you need to look for when you're practicing feminist criticism. And then, of course, what Della says, she makes, a whole big deal out of her hair. She loves her hair. It's her beautiful hair. It's very important to her. So again, just importance on the, materialistic things, the very little things in life that feminist criticism is kind of highlighting in this specific context, saying that Della is obsessed with the hair, the makeup, her reflection, very female things to be worried about. And then, of course, she decides to cut off all her hair and sell it for Jim's present, kind of giving away everything she thought was important just to please her man. So definitely, again, a whole other feminist criticism about how she just wants to please her husband. It doesn't matter how much money they have. It's all about her making sure that he owns her and that, she lives up to that standard. So this is just a little way that you can portray the feminist criticism lens to a short story. For your homework assignment, I want you to find a short story online, annotate at least the first 4 paragraphs of the short story through a feminist criticism lens. Then you're going to bring in that story tomorrow in class, and we're going to break off into pairs and share the story that you found and why you think it's important to analyze it through a critical lens.